Part 1, The Barrier, breaks. Violet stood at the edge of the singing forest where the ancient trees grew so tall that their tops disappeared into clouds. She was different from other elves. While they spent their time in grand crystal halls discussing old magic and older traditions, Violet preferred to be alone with her two dragons. Obsidian was a massive creature with scales as dark as midnight, and Ember was smaller but burned with a fierce golden light. These two dragons were the only friends Violet truly needed. The day started like any other day in Ethermore. The sun filtered through the crystalline barriers that protected the elf kingdom from the outside world. These barriers had existed for thousands of years, keeping humans and all their chaos and violence far away from the peaceful elves. Most elves never questioned why they needed these barriers. They simply accepted that humans were dangerous and that separation was the only way to survive. But Violet often wondered what lay beyond the barriers. She had read old books about the human world, stories told by traveling elves who had visited before the barriers became absolute. She imagined cities built from stone instead of crystal, and she imagined humans who created art and music just like elves did. Were they really so different? Were they truly so violent and uncaring? Violet wanted to know the truth, not just what the Council of Elders told her to believe. Obsidian suddenly lifted his massive head and made a sound that was both a growl and a song. Ember echoed the call, and both dragons looked toward the western sky. Violet could feel something too, a disturbance in the magical barrier like a crack forming in perfect glass. The dragons moved together, flying toward the source of the disturbance, and Violet ran after them on foot, her long elf legs carrying her swiftly through the forest. When she arrived at the barrier, she stopped dead in her tracks. There was a massive tear in the protective shield, and through it came a human woman in battle armor. The woman was falling from the sky, surrounded by the flames of broken magic. She crashed hard into the ground, rolling through crystalline grass and leaving deep furrows in the earth. Her armor was scorched and dented, her face was covered in blood, and her weapon had been shattered into pieces. Violet's first instinct was to run. The Council had warned her entire life about humans. They were told that humans were brutal killers who would destroy Ethermore if given the chance. They were taught that humans felt only anger and hunger and destruction. This woman looked like proof of everything Violet had been taught. She was covered in weapons and blood and the signs of terrible violence. But then Violet looked into the human woman's eyes. The woman was trying to push herself up off the ground, her whole body shaking from pain and exhaustion. Her eyes were green like spring leaves, and they held something that Violet recognized immediately. They held fear and desperation and a fierce will to survive. In those eyes, Violet saw not a monster but a person who had suffered and was still fighting. The human woman noticed Violet and froze. She reached for a broken sword at her side, but her hand was shaking too badly to lift it. She tried to speak, but only blood came from her lips. Her body gave up the fight, and she collapsed onto the crystal grass. Obsidian and Ember circled overhead, confused by this strange creature that had fallen from the sky. Violet made a choice that went against everything she had been taught. She ran toward the human woman instead of away from her. She knelt down and checked if the woman was still breathing. Yes, she was. Her heartbeat was strong, though her body was broken. Violet looked at the massive tear in the barrier and knew that the other elves would soon discover it. She had only minutes to decide what to do. Moving faster than she had ever moved before, Violet carefully lifted the wounded human woman. The woman was heavier than she looked, and her armor was still hot from dragonfire. But Violet was stronger than normal elves because she spent her time flying and climbing with her dragons. She managed to carry the woman away from the barrier, deeper into the forest, toward her private sanctuary that only Obsidian and Ember knew about. Obsidian landed beside her, and Violet climbed onto his back while still holding the unconscious woman. The great dragon took to the sky, his wings moving with powerful strokes. Ember flew close beside them, his golden scales catching the fading light. They flew deeper into the singing forest, away from the populated areas of Ethermore, away from the cities of crystal towers and gathering halls. Finally, they arrived at Violet's secret place. It was a cave hidden inside a mountain of living crystal that seemed to have grown naturally from the earth. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like magic and ancient stone. Violet had discovered this place years ago when she was exploring far from home. She had spent countless nights here, listening to the crystal sing its strange songs, dreaming about what lay beyond the barriers. She laid the human woman carefully on a bed of soft moss that grew on the crystal floor. The moss was magical and had healing properties. Already, Violet could see some of the woman's worst wounds beginning to close, but many of her injuries were too severe for the moss alone to heal. The woman would need real care, real medicine, real time to recover. Violet sat beside the unconscious woman and wondered what she had done. By bringing this human into Ethermore, she had broken the oldest laws of her kingdom. If the council discovered what she had done, she would be banished or worse. And yet she could not have left this woman to die. Something inside her had demanded that she act with compassion rather than fear. The human woman stirred and made a sound of pain. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she looked at Violet. For just a second, fear flashed across her face. Then her eyes closed again and she fell back into unconsciousness. Violet stayed awake through the entire night, watching the stranger breathe, wondering what would happen when she woke up, and knowing that everything in her world was about to change forever. Part 2: The Human Awakens. 3 days passed in the crystal cave. Violet brought water from the magical springs and cleaned the human woman's wounds with care. She applied healing herbs and whispered words of magic over the injuries, willing them to close and mend. She had never healed anyone before. Elves rarely needed healing because they lived such long and careful lives. But something in Violet responded to the challenge. She found that she had a gift for it. The human woman woke and fell back into fever dreams many times. Sometimes she called out names that meant nothing to Violet. Sometimes she fought invisible enemies, her hands moving in combat patterns even while lying on the soft moss. Violet had to hold her down during these episodes to keep her from reopening her wounds. The woman was strong and fierce even in her pain. Even broken and bleeding, she fought like a warrior. On the 4th day, the woman's eyes opened and stayed open. She looked around the cave with confusion and wonder, taking in the glowing crystal walls and the strange magical light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her green eyes finally focused on Violet and she tried to sit up, but her body was too weak, and she fell back onto the moss with a groan. Violet was ready with water and a cloth soaked in healing herbs. She helped the woman drink slowly. The water was cool and seemed to bring some clarity to the human's mind. The woman looked at Violet again, and this time fear was replaced by curiosity. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a rough whisper. The woman's name was Maya. She was a warrior from a land called Meridian, far beyond the barrier that separated the elf kingdom from the human world. She had been fighting in a war against creatures that should not exist, creatures that were half machine, half alive, created by a dark force that sought to conquer her world. During a battle, she had been chased by these creatures toward the barrier. She thought the barrier was just a wall of energy, something she could break through. Instead, it had caught her and thrown her violently into the elf world. Violet listened to this story with growing alarm. If creatures like that existed in the human world, then the barriers around Ethermore might not be strong enough to protect them. These creatures sounded more dangerous than anything the ancient elves had predicted when they first built the barriers thousands of years ago. But more than the story itself, Violet was struck by how Maya told it. The human woman spoke with honor and duty. She explained how she had been fighting to protect her home and her people. She described her soldiers and her friends who had died in battle. Her eyes were sad when she spoke of these losses, and her voice was gentle. This did not match anything Violet had been taught about humans. She had been told that humans only cared about power and conquest. Maya seemed to care about something deeper, something that looked a lot like love. Over the next week, Maya's strength slowly returned. She could sit up now and even stand, though she still moved carefully to avoid reopening her wounds. Violet brought her food from the forest, fresh fruits and herbs that grew in the crystalline soil of Ethermore. Maya was amazed by the taste and the colors of the food. She said nothing in her world looked or tasted like it. Violet tried teaching Maya some of the elf language, the words that would help her communicate with the kingdom. But Maya struggled with the flowing musical sounds. Her human throat could not make many of the tones that came naturally to elves. Still, Maya tried. She worked hard to learn, making Violet laugh with her attempts to pronounce even simple words. In turn, Maya taught Violet the human language, words that were harsher and more direct, but also somehow more passionate. On the 8th day, Violet decided that Maya was strong enough for a bigger adventure. She brought Maya to the entrance of the cave where Obsidian and Ember waited. Maya's eyes went wide with fear when she saw the dragons, but Violet took her hand and led her forward. She spoke to the dragons in their own language, a language of sensation and emotion and color that only Violet truly understood. Obsidian lowered himself so Maya could touch his scales. At first Maya was terrified, but as she felt the smooth, cool texture of his midnight skin, her fear began to fade. She ran her hands along his massive side and looked up at Violet with wonder. Ember did a small circle around them, his golden scales bright and warm. He made a sound like singing, and Maya laughed. It was the first time Violet had heard her laugh, and the sound was like music. Violet helped Maya climb onto Obsidian's back. The dragon rose slowly, carefully, giving Maya time to adjust. Then, with powerful strokes of his wings, he lifted into the sky. Maya screamed, but it was not a scream of fear. It was the scream of someone experiencing something impossibly beautiful and terrifying at the same time. They flew over the singing forest, and Violet showed Maya the wonders of Ethermoor from above. Below them, the crystal towers of the elf cities sparkled in the sunlight. The gardens bloomed with flowers and colors that did not exist in the human world. The waterfalls sang their ancient songs, and the light reflected off the water in 1,000 rainbow patterns. Maya cried as they flew, tears streaming down her face. She had thought she would never see beauty again when she crashed through that barrier. She had expected to die in a strange land filled with enemies. Instead, she had found wonders that she could never have imagined. When they landed, Maya was shaking with emotion. She held on to Violet and thanked her over and over again. She promised that she would find a way home, that she would not cause trouble for Violet or the Elf Kingdom. But even as she said these words, both of them knew the truth. Maya did not want to leave, and Violet did not want her to go. But Violet also knew that this could not remain hidden forever. Eventually, the other elves would find out about the human in their world. Eventually, they would have to face the council and the ancient laws. Violet held Maya close and tried to prepare herself for the storm that was coming. Part 3: Discovery and Conflict. The discovery came on the 15th day. An elf named Carson, who worked for the council, was patrolling the forest near the barrier to check for damage. He found the enormous tear that Violet had been hoping no one would notice for a little longer. He also found tracks leading away from the barrier, deep into the forest. The tracks were not made by any creature that lived in Ethermoor. Within hours, the entire council knew about the breach. By nightfall, they had issued a summons for Violet to appear before them at the Crystal Hall. She received the message from a young elf courier who refused to meet her eyes. The message was clear. The council knew about the human. They wanted answers. Violet told Maya to stay in the cave and not to leave under any circumstances. Maya wanted to come with her to face the council together, but Violet refused. She knew that bringing Maya to the Crystal Hall would only make things worse. At least this way, there was a chance, however small, that the council would show mercy to Violet alone. The Crystal Hall was the largest building in Ethermoor. Its walls glowed with ancient magic, and its ceiling stretched so high that it disappeared into darkness. The Council of Elders sat in a semicircle of stone thrones that seemed to grow from the floor itself. There were 7 of them, and they had lived for longer than most forests had existed. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had made the decision to seal Ethermoor away from the human world, and they had no intention of reversing that decision. The eldest was named Aldrich. He had bright silver eyes that reflected light like mirrors, and his voice was slow and deliberate, as if every word he spoke would be remembered forever. He asked Violet to explain herself. Why had she brought a human into their kingdom? Did she understand the danger? Did she realize she had broken the most important law of Ethermoor? Violet tried to explain, but her voice shook as she spoke. She told them about finding Maya at the barrier, about how the human woman had been wounded and dying. She tried to explain that Maya was not a monster, that she was a person with hopes and dreams and honor. She spoke about the creatures in the human world, the half-machine things that hunted in that realm. She suggested that perhaps the barriers needed to be stronger, or that perhaps communication with humans might be possible. The council listened in silence. When Violet finished speaking, there was a long pause. Then Aldrich spoke again. He said that Violet was young and did not understand the weight of history. He explained that humans had been kept separate for a reason. Long ago, before the barriers, humans and elves had lived together. But humans brought war and greed and destruction. They wanted to own everything, to control everything. The elves had been forced to withdraw and build the barriers to protect themselves. That history was not something that had been forgotten or overcome. Another council member named Iris spoke up. She was younger than Aldrich, perhaps only a few hundred years old. She said that Violet was foolish, but that perhaps her foolishness showed hope. Perhaps, she suggested, it was time to reconsider the barriers. Perhaps there was a chance for peace that had not existed before, but Aldrich shut down this suggestion immediately. He said that the barriers would remain. He said that Violet would surrender the human to be exiled back through the barrier at dawn. And he said that Violet herself would be stripped of her title as a keeper of dragons and would be restricted to the crystal cities where her movements could be monitored. Violet felt her world crumbling. She would lose her dragons, the two beings she loved most in the world. She would be imprisoned in the cities, cut off from the forest and the freedom she had always known. And Maya would be sent back to a world where she was being hunted by monsters. She stood up and did something that no elf in memory had ever done before. She refused the council. She said that she would not surrender Maya, and she would not accept their punishment. She said that their laws were wrong, that fear had ruled Ethermore for too long, and that it was time for change. Aldrich's eyes flashed with anger. He declared Violet to be in violation of the council's authority. He said that if she did not surrender Maya by dawn, both Violet and the human would be exiled from Ethermore forever. They would be banished beyond the barriers and left to fend for themselves in a dangerous world. Violet turned and walked out of the crystal hall. Behind her, she could hear Aldrich calling for guards, but she did not stop. She ran through the streets of the crystal city toward the forest. She ran faster than she had ever run before. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she knew that she had just changed everything. When she reached the cave, Maya was waiting at the entrance with Obsidian and Ember. Somehow the dragons had known. They had told Maya that something was wrong, and Maya had prepared them for travel. She had the few belongings they had gathered together, and she was ready to leave. Violet told Maya about the council's decision. She told her that they had been given until dawn to leave Ethermore, to cross the barrier and never return. She expected Maya to be afraid or angry. Instead, Maya took her hand and said that wherever they had to go, they would go together. In the distance, Violet could hear the sound of elf warriors being summoned. The council was not going to wait until dawn. They were coming now to capture them and force them beyond the barrier. Violet looked at Maya, at Obsidian, and at Ember. She made a choice. She would not go back. She would not surrender. She would fly into the unknown and try to find a way to change her world from beyond the barriers. She climbed onto Obsidian's back and helped Maya climb on behind her. Ember flew close beside them. Together, the three friends lifted into the night sky, leaving Ethermore behind, not knowing where they were going or what they would find, knowing only that they had to stay together. Part 4. Beyond the barrier. The barrier felt like flying through a wall of lightning. When Obsidian's wings first touched it, the magical energy shocked through them all. Violet gasped and held tight to the dragon's neck. Maya screamed behind her and Ember shrieked in pain, but the dragons did not stop. They had lived their entire lives carrying Violet across Ethermore. They trusted her completely, and if she was flying through the barrier, they would follow. For a moment that felt like an eternity. They were caught between two worlds. Violet could see the crystal towers of Ethermore behind her, and the dark wilderness of the human world ahead. She felt the barrier pulling at her, trying to tear her back into the elf kingdom. She felt the magic fighting her, telling her to turn around, to accept the council's punishment, to choose safety over freedom. Then they broke through. They emerged into a world that was nothing like the crystal beauty of Ethermore. It was night, and below them was a landscape scarred by war. Entire forests had been burned. Cities lay in ruins. The earth itself looked wounded, as if something terrible had torn through the land and left nothing but destruction behind. Maya gasped when she saw it. This was her home, and it had been devastated by the war she had been fighting. Obsidian flew lower, searching for somewhere safe to land. The sky was filled with smoke and ash, and it was hard to see anything clearly. Violet used her connection with Obsidian to guide him, sensing the land below and looking for places where the ground was stable enough for the dragon to land safely. Finally, they found a small clearing in what remained of a forest. The trees here were blackened but still standing. Obsidian touched down gently, and Violet felt his legs buckle slightly from the exertion of flying through the barrier. Ember landed beside them, and for a moment all four of them just sat in silence, trying to understand what had just happened. Maya climbed down from Obsidian's back and fell to her knees on the burned ground. She began to cry, seeing her world broken and destroyed. Violet had never seen anything like the destruction around them. The elves had lived in peace for so long that she could barely imagine warfare of this scale. But Maya had lived in it. She had been fighting in this war, trying to protect her people from the creatures that hunted them. Maya explained what had happened while they rested. The creatures that hunted her world were called the Hollow Ones. They were not purely alive and not purely mechanical. They were something between, created by a force of dark magic that came from beyond even the human world. The Hollow Ones wanted to consume all living things and convert them into more of themselves. They were like a plague, spreading across the land and leaving only ruin behind them. When Maya had first encountered the creatures, her kingdom had not believed her. They thought she was telling tall tales or exaggerating the danger. By the time they understood the truth, the creatures had already spread across half the continent. Entire cities had been lost. Millions of humans had died or been converted into new Hollow Ones. Maya's soldiers had been trying to find a way to stop them, but they were losing ground every day. Violet felt her heart break listening to this story. She had thought the human world was like Ethermore, a place of beauty and peace. Instead, it was a nightmare of war and suffering. And now she understood why the elves had built the barriers in the first place. Not because they feared humans, but because the human world itself was chaotic and dangerous. It was a world of conflict and pain that the elves had wanted to protect themselves from. But then Violet looked at Maya's face, at the fierce determination and the unwavering will that shone in her green eyes, and she realized something important. Yes, the human world was dangerous. Yes, it was filled with conflict and destruction, but humans like Maya fought through that danger anyway. They fought to protect others. They fought for hope and freedom even when victory seemed impossible. That kind of strength and courage was something the elves could learn from. Violet told Maya that they could not go back to Ethermore, but they also could not run forever. There had to be a way to help, to use the power of the dragons and the magic of the elves to stop the Hollow Ones. She told Maya that she had seen ancient elf texts about creatures like the Hollow, ones in the library of the Crystal Hall. She believed there might be a way to destroy them, or at least to slow them down, but first they needed supplies and information. They needed to find humans who could help them. Violet asked Maya where the stronghold of her people was, the last place where humans still held the line against the creatures. Maya pointed toward the east, toward the mountains where her people had retreated. It would be a dangerous journey. The Hollow Ones roamed everywhere in the land, but it was the only chance they had. Violet and Maya spent the next few days gathering information and preparing for the journey ahead. They used the dragons to scout ahead, and they found places where humans still resisted. They found small groups of warriors still fighting, and they found civilians hiding in underground bunkers and caves. Everywhere they went, people told stories of loss and suffering, but also of people who refused to give up. On the third day, they encountered a human settlement that had not yet been destroyed. It was a small town hidden in a valley, protected by steep cliffs on all sides. When the people there saw the dragons, they were terrified at first. But Maya was able to convince them that Violet was an ally, not an enemy. She told them about the elf woman who had saved her life, about the magic and power that the elves might be able to bring to their fight. The leader of the settlement was a woman named Grace. She was older than Maya, with gray streaking her dark hair, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had led others through impossible situations. When she heard Violet's story, she nodded slowly. She said that she had always hoped that one day the elves might choose to help. She said that hope was something humans needed now more than anything else. Grace brought Violet and Maya to a hidden war room, where maps of the entire continent were spread out on long tables. The red areas on the maps showed where the Hollow Ones had conquered. The blue areas showed where humans still held territory. The map was mostly red now, with just small pockets of blue remaining. But Grace pointed at these blue areas and said that within them lived millions of humans who still fought, who still hoped, who still believed in a future where their world could be healed. Violet looked at the maps and made a decision that would change the course of her life. She would help these humans. She would not return to Ethermore and accept exile or banishment. She would stay here, in this broken world, and she would use everything she had learned from the elves to help the humans survive and fight back against the darkness that consumed their land. Part 5: A New Alliance. The months that followed were the hardest of Violet's life, but also the most meaningful. She and Maya worked together with the humans to develop a strategy for fighting back against the Hollow Ones. Violet shared the knowledge she had brought from Ethermore, ancient elf texts about creatures of dark magic and how to counter them. She taught the human warriors about elf combat techniques, which were very different from human warfare but could be adapted to their needs. More importantly, she brought hope. The humans had been fighting alone for so long that they had begun to forget that they were not the only intelligent species in the world. The arrival of Violet with her magical abilities and her dragons reminded them that there was more to the world than their war. There were places of beauty and peace where beings of great power existed. If the elves had chosen to help, perhaps they could actually win this war. Grace proved to be a remarkable leader and ally. She had fought in wars before the Hollow Ones came, and she knew how to coordinate soldiers and plan military campaigns. She worked with Violet to develop a battle strategy that used the dragons as powerful weapons while also using the dragon's ability to fly and scout to gather intelligence about where the Hollow Ones were moving. The first real battle came 2 months after Violet and Maya had arrived at Grace's settlement. A large group of Hollow Ones was attacking a convoy of humans carrying supplies and refugees to another stronghold. The creatures were terrifying to look at, with bodies that were half machine and half flesh, eyes that glowed with an eerie blue light, and movements that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Violet and Maya rode on Obsidian while Ember flew beside them. When they saw the Hollow Ones attacking the convoy, Violet felt a moment of fear. She had never fought before. She had been a keeper of dragons, a student of magic, but never a warrior. But then she looked at Maya beside her, felt the confidence in Maya's body pressed against her back, and she knew what she had to do. Violet spoke to Obsidian in the language of dragons, telling him to dive toward the creatures. The dragon responded immediately, his massive wings folding as he dove through the air. Violet raised her hands, gathering the magic that flowed through Ethermore, the magic that the elves had used for thousands of years. She shaped it into bolts of pure energy that crashed down on the Hollow Ones, burning through their mechanical parts and disrupting the dark magic that kept them alive. Ember attacked from the side, his golden fire washing across a group of creatures and turning them to ash. Maya used her sword to protect the refugees, cutting down creatures that got too close to the convoy. The humans who had come with them fought with fierce determination, using weapons that Violet had helped them craft using elf knowledge of magic and engineering. The battle lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. When it was over, the remaining Hollow Ones had retreated and the convoy had been saved. Not a single refugee had been killed. The humans cheered when they realized they had won, and they looked at Violet with new hope in their eyes. For the first time in this war, they had defeated the creatures without losing anyone. They had learned that the Hollow Ones could be beaten. Word of the victory spread quickly through the human settlements. More and more warriors came to join forces with Violet, Maya, and Grace. They gathered at the stronghold, and Grace organized them into units that could work with Obsidian and Ember. They trained day after day, learning how to fight alongside the dragons, learning the elf magic that Violet could teach them, but not everyone was happy about the alliance. Some human leaders questioned whether they could trust an elf. Some were afraid that Violet was leading them into a trap. There were whispers of doubt and fear. Maya had to fight hard to convince some of the skeptics that Violet was genuine, that she had truly given up everything to help them. One evening, Maya took Violet away from the camp so they could be alone. They climbed to the top of a cliff that overlooked the mountains, and they could see for miles in every direction. In the distance, they could see the dark areas where the Hollow Ones had conquered, and they could see the blue areas where humans still held territory. But they could also see other things. They could see forests that were slowly beginning to grow again. They could see settlements where humans were rebuilding, creating new hope from the ashes of war. Maya told Violet that she had never believed she would survive this long. She had thought that the human world was doomed, that the Hollow Ones would consume everything and there would be nothing left but darkness. But now she believed differently. She believed that with Violet and the dragons they might actually have a chance to turn the tide. She believed that humans and elves together could accomplish things that neither could accomplish alone. Violet held Maya's hand and looked out at the vast world that stretched before them. She thought about Ethermore and the life she had left behind. She thought about her family and the other elves who would probably see her as a traitor, but she did not regret her choice. She had discovered something in this human world that she had never found in the peaceful crystal halls of Ethermore. She had discovered purpose and love, and the kind of hope that only comes from fighting for something you believe in. Over the next year, the alliance between Violet and the humans became stronger. More battles were fought and more victories were won. The humans learned that the Hollow Ones were not invincible. They learned that together, they could drive back the darkness. Settlements that had been abandoned were reclaimed. Refugees were brought to safety. Slowly, city by city, the humans began to push back against the creatures that had invaded their world. Violet became known throughout the human kingdoms as the elf warrior who had chosen to fight alongside humans. She was no longer an outcast or an exile. She was a hero, a symbol of hope and unity. But more than that, she was someone who had changed. Someone who had grown beyond the limitations of her own people and had discovered the true meaning of courage and compassion. In the quiet moments, when the battles were won and they had a little time to rest, Violet and Maya would sit together and talk about the future. They talked about what would happen after the war was over, after the Hollow Ones had been defeated. They talked about building something new, something that included both elves and humans working together. They talked about breaking down the barriers between their worlds. Not the magical barriers, but the barriers of fear and prejudice that had kept them apart for so long. Obsidian and Ember would rest beside them, their scales reflecting the starlight. And Violet would think about how far she had come from that day when she found a wounded human warrior, crashing through the barrier into her world. She had lost everything she had known, but she had gained something infinitely more valuable. She had gained a family, a purpose, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from walls and barriers, but from the courage to reach across them and connect with those who are different from you.